This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is two or three-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 661, entitled Verbally Violent Mass Clashes on Campus Between Monoconscious Feminists and Biconscious Masculists. Description. Masculists and MGTOW ideas just keep spreading and spreading across the planet. There are more and more MGTOWs and Masculists who feel an ever-growing hatred at fluffies and fluffy feminists for the horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes that women commit against men. Within a few years, it's likely that there will be dozens of Masculists at a feminist meeting, causing an explosion of Masculist anger and hatred, leading to the historical equivalent of the Stonewall Riots of the gays in 1969, but this time with Masculists. Security guards are called in and a riot occurs. The university president then steps in and decides to help menfair the campus, to prevent even more violence coming from armies of young men who are fed to the teeth with the sexist hypocrisy of monoconscious feminists. Flyer itself. Verbally violent mass clashes on campus between monoconscious feminists and biconscious masculists, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. I believe that it's only a few years away before the level of hatred amongst young men, masculisted young men, at the massive gender injustices committed by fluffies and fluffy feminists against men, that verbally violent mass clashes will be occurring on campus, often the first place where ideological revolutions become real. Masculists and MGTOW ideas just keep spreading and spreading across the planet, especially in the developed first world, which has the best telecommunications, the highest living standards, where ideas spread quickly, so that whole social movements can get off the ground in just a few years. I would say that most first world young men, educated young men, now realize that modern marriage is toxic for men, since a young father will face a 1 in 4 chance of being butchered in the hated fluffy feminist-controlled divorce court system, which sees men as cash machines to be robbed and abused, forced to pay fluffy women to raise their, that is the women's, children, with no moral nor legal obligation on these parasitic, man-slaving, divorce-raping women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, brackets, FIP, F-I-P, equals financially independent person, by bothering to become financially competent and adult, pulling their financial weight, and not expecting, fluffy style, to live off the money and labour of a man, man-slaving him for years. Masculists have a real hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists, seeing them as man-slaving, divorce-raping vermin, whom the Masculists aim to literally exterminate by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, so that as most men become masculisted and see fluffydom as man-slavery and man-slavery as slavery, and hence hated and a war issue, then most men will force these fluffies and fluffy feminists to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at, utterly rejected both socially and sexually, so that they die slow, miserable deaths for their horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men, for their man-slavery, their divorce rape, their forced fathering, and other horrible, hateable gender crimes. With Masculist and MGTOW ideas spreading and spreading, the pressure in the Masculist gender political kettle keeps rising as the hatred level grows and the number of young masculisted men, particularly on campus, keeps growing, until sooner or later, probably only a few years from now, a revolution will occur in which dozens of young men collectively will explode in a public meeting on campus in a manner similar to what happened to the gays in 1969 in the so-called Stonewall Riots, because they started at the Stonewall Inn in the Greenwich Village in New York. when a police raid took place against the gays in that gay bar on June 28, 1969. The gays went a riot that lasted 6 days, with many violent clashes between police and the gays. This explosion then led to the creation of a gay liberation movement that spread round the world. Why did the gays riot? Because they were so fed up, so hateful of the prejudice shown them by society, and particularly by the police, who kept raiding their gay bars. Something similar is now happening with young men on campus, who are now in a minority of males, outnumbered 2 to 1 by females, who express a deeply misandrist, monoconscious feminism that sees men as toxic, as morally inferior, as contemptible. Young men are increasingly fed up with this. The feminists have had a gender political monopoly for 6 decades, so that young male campus students have not had, until recently, their own male gender political ideology that they can use to answer back to the feminists. So typically, until recently, whenever a young male campus student was the victim of some feminist harangue, he just slunk away, unable to meet the angry critique of the feminists. But times have changed. Now men have masculism, men's lib, which claims that women oppress men worse, far worse than vice versa, with many of women's horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men, which are far more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women, that the feminists keep harping on, for example, sexual harassment, domestic violence, even rape, that cannot compete in seriousness with women's horrible gender crimes of manslavery, divorce, rape, and forced fathering, the big 3 that the Masculists place such emphasis on due to their horrible nature. So now, increasingly, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of young men who have had their masculinist consciousness raised, who now see that women oppress men far worse with the above big 3, and hence see monoconscious feminists as hypocrites, as gender politically ignorant, monoconscious bigots, and learn to despise them, and by degrees to hate them, as they become increasingly aware of what these fluffies and fluffy feminists are doing to men on a daily basis, especially in the divorce courts, where one father in 4 is butchered. The better informed a young masculist is, the more conscious he becomes that monoconscious feminism is a cancer. That is not to say that a lot of what the feminists are saying is valid. Biconscious masculists, by definition, are aware of feminist arguments, since biconscious means that one has had both one's feminist and one's masculinist consciousnesses raised. That is, one sees that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that women oppress men worse. So when a biconscious masculist hears some monoconscious feminist expressing misandrist opinions in public, he feels real anger and even hatred at that woman, since he knows what fluffies do to men, manslaving men for decades and divorce raping one father in 4, which are truly hateable gender crimes in the eyes of the masculists. So increasingly now, there will be dozens of young men in a campus audience who have had their masculinist consciousnesses raised, and hence will be greatly intolerant of MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, who express misandrous opinions in public, and will be a lot more inclined to riot, that is, to explode in masculinist hatred at what fluffies and fluffy feminists do to men. On campus, there are often feminist so-called gender studies professors who in reality preach misandry to their female students, who typically know nothing about masculinist ideas, so deserve the label monoconscious. Masculists make a big deal about the distinction between monoconscious and biconscious feminists. Masculists have a hatred of monoconscious feminists, seeing them as MFBs, monoconscious feminazi bigots, as sexist, hypocritical bigots, as misandrist, male-dumping feminazi cunts, the type of women that biconscious masculists spit at, have a hatred for, and definitely do not have anything to do with them, not even pumping and dumping them. As most men become masculisted, monoconscious feminists will die out, forced to rot on the shelf. It's the awful hypocrisy of monoconscious feminists that so enrages and causes such hatred in Masculists against them. So it's only a question of time, as the number of Masculists on campus keeps increasing and the level of biconscious Masculist hatred of monoconscious feminism keeps growing, before the Masculist campus riots start, equivalent to what happened with the Stonewall Riots. To picture how this explosion might happen, consider the following. Probably the Masculist explosion will occur in several steps. The most likely source of misandrous comments made in public will be in a feminist meeting. Imagine that by chance there are a lot of men at this meeting and several dozen of them are Masculists, Biconscious Masculists, who are fed to the teeth with misandrous, monoconscious, feminazi bitches and have no patience with them. So imagine one of these Masculists raises his voice saying, quote, "You women oppress men worse with your manslavery, your divorce rape, your forced fathering. Men don't want relationship with misandrous, male-dumping, feminazi cunts. Masculists see you monoconscious feminists as hypocrites, fat, unfuckable hypocrites. So we punish you by totally ignoring you, forcing you to rot on a shelf." End quote. The MC, that's Mistress of Ceremonies, of this feminist meeting then says, quote, "This is a feminist meeting. If you don't keep quiet, I will call security and have you thrown out." End quote. Then a second Masculist in the audience calls out, quote, "He's right. We men are fed up with your feminazi bitchery. You trash men, you fat unfuckable cunt. You women have 10% smaller brains, you dumb fuck bitch. Let him speak. He's telling the truth." End quote. The MC feminist then tells her sidekick to call security to have these two guys thrown out. Then a third guy stands up and says, quote, "You feminists have been dumping on men for decades. We men are fed up with this. A lot of the men in this audience are Masculists, so we know that gender oppression is a two-way street. You women oppress men too, and in fact worse. If you want to keep the man in your life, then you had better learn some masculism before he does, or he will see your monoconsciousness as bigotry and he'll dump your ass." End quote. The security man then arrives, a big, beefy, gorilla sort of guy, but only him, one man. Two other men in the audience then call out to the security guy, quote, "Hey guy, if you touch any Masculists in this room, you'll end up with a bloody nose. There are probably several dozen Masculists in this audience, and we are fed up with being pushed around by hated, misandrous, feminazi cunts. So if you want to stay healthy, I suggest you leave now, or a dozen Masculists will hurt you." End quote. The security guy then quickly calls for backup on his walkie-talkie. He ignores the Masculists who just spoke to him and approaches him. Then a dozen guys step out to confront him, stopping him in his tracks. He pulls out his gun. Some of the Masculists back off at the sight of a gun. But some of the other Masculists stand firm and tell the security man, quote, "We Masculists are making a stand here. Have you heard of the Stonewall Riots of the gays in 1969, where the gays rioted against the prejudice of the cops? Well, if you shoot one of us, you will destroy your life and you will create a riot and you might even be killed. Understand what is happening here and back off, or go down in history as the guy who shot the first Masculist." End quote. Then some other security guys come, and the many Masculists in the audience then start screaming, quote, "Get out, you hated male feminists. Learn some masculism. Learn that gender oppression is a two-way street. You are men. Stop being traitors to your own sex. Learn how women oppress men." End quote. Eventually, the security guys arrest several dozen Masculists, and the feminist meeting continues, but the damage has been done. The Masculists, as a group, go see the president of the university and tell him in no uncertain terms that if he doesn't stop the misandry and create a menfair atmosphere on campus, then he will only create a lot more trouble. The male president is a smart, open-minded sort of man, so quickly learns how strong masculist arguments are and decides to set up a men's studies course and hires 2 masculist professors. He also arranges for a series of masculist articles to be written in the student newspaper and blogs to educate his campus on masculist ideas. 6 months later, the gender political mood on that campus has changed radically. Boyfriends are telling their girlfriends that if they, that's the girlfriends, remain monoconscious feminists, then they will run the risk of being dumped. Since now, many young men on campus have had their masculist consciousnesses raised and find the monoconsciousness of their girlfriends intolerable, so find a new girlfriend. As this kind of thing happens many times, the mood on campus shifts. Women learn that learning some masculism will earn them some brownie points with men. So female masculist groups pop up on campus with the theme, quote, "How to keep your masculist boyfriend." In time, similar developments occur on other campuses and then to the media, and via the media to the masses, until masculism becomes as historically important as was feminism in changing the ways men and women live. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, click on the Masculist tab for 660 plus Masculist essays and their videos. See also a London Real interview on masculism at AI will kill 1 billion people, do we create our exterminators, ? Professor Hugo de Garis, London Real. In brackets, see the last half hour of this 2-hour interview for the Masculist segment. These flyers are available in text and video format on Minds, BitChute,